Africa's economy is not growing according to expectations. Dr. Martyn Davies says it's the result of built-in inequalities. He believes most of the country's problems can be solved if the economy grows at 5.5% a year. Dr. Martyn Davies joins me now to discuss this and other themes as we build up to Budget 2022. So your predictions, not predictions as such, your scenario that would sort of help the economy out of this funk in which it is stuck matches exactly what the National Development Plan told us all those many years ago in terms of the rate at which the economy needs to be growing consistently for us to, start making a dent on unemployment, inequality and poverty. But we've simply not seen those levels of growth, even before COVID-19 was a factor, Dr. Davies. So just your thinking about how do we move from where we are? Firstly, where are we in terms of this whole narrative around economic growth? We'll talk about how we move from where we are to where we want to be. Where are we in your assessment?
So this is where you sketch the situation very accurately. South Africa is an economy that for many years now has performed certainly way below its potential. I would argue a potential growth rate is easy 5% plus GDP. If we rewind, think back to 2007, 2008, we had incredibly low debt to GDP levels. It was roughly around about sort of 27, 28%. Now the situation is we have significantly higher debt, roughly 80, 85%, but of course coming down and further consolidation expected from a budget speech. Point being is, and if you think back to 2007, 2008, we were growing at that figure, that magical figure above 5% with fiscal conservative policies. We called it gear at the time. So this notion as you have to spend to grow is I think, incorrect. We've spent a great deal and the commensurate growth has not come through. This talks to the, what we often use this phrase, structural problems in the economy. My conclusion being, at a high level, is that a conservative, pragmatic budget is all very well, but it isn't going to drive growth. This needs a pragmatic budget needs to be coupled with serious and accelerated structural reform across other departments of government.
So we'll talk in a moment about the other aspects that you think weighs in the equation, the whole more liberal economy, if I understood your comments correctly. But let's start with that issue of structural reforms. This has been a buzzword, a buzz phrase for at least the last 5 to 7, if not longer, in terms of the number of years we've been talking about this. Government, when President Cyril Ramaphosa takes to the podium, he's always punting what they've done towards achieving these structural reforms. So things such as the Operation Vulindlela between National Treasury and the Presidency, some of the issues around energy sector and the mining charter having been dealt with, e-visa, etc., etc. We're still not making a dent towards having these reforms starting to have the kind of impact we want?
Well, this is where you mentioned the NDP earlier. Isn't that a blueprint for structural reform? So that's been around for quite a long time. We already have the plans, but in typical South African fashion, we lack the implementation. We have a political rhetoric, but we need to move beyond rhetoric, of course, to very, very swift action. Just to step back a second, structural reform, I often say, is a euphemism or another phrase for politically difficult to do reform. Successful countries are those that continuously seek to challenge vested interests, to disrupt themselves, in many cases. But above all, it's about getting a functional state going and correct the perennial challenge which has been state-owned enterprises. We all know this, and these are a major handbrake, anchor, if you will, on the growth potential of our economy.
So, picking up from where you're leaving it off, you're saying, and I like what you're saying, that structural reforms is a euphemism for politically difficult decisions. Some of what we're talking about here, Dr. Martyn Davies, is already proving to be politically unpopular. Things such as, curbing the public sector wage bill. That comes with practical decisions that you are making that you can see and feel in terms of the employment of people in the public sector, but also some already complaining about the impact on services that are delivered, as well as what you are saying around state-owned enterprises, that you've got to make the big decisions around the state-owned enterprises, perhaps even going as far as to seeking strategic equity partners, or even exiting some of these enterprises where it's not necessary. All of these, I don't think I need to tell you, are very unpopular in South Africa.
Well, the job market is not zero-sum at all. I mean, I would say that, what we need from a state perspective, be it local, be it provincial or municipal, provincial or national, is the effective delivery of public goods and services to the citizenry. What are those services? The basic, obviously, being healthcare, education, basic infrastructure at the very most basic, power, and of course security. If those services are not being delivered effectively, and as a private citizen to this, do you think they are? We could. I haven't heard a South African citizen for a long time being totally satisfied as to how public goods and services are being delivered. Therefore, the high-cost state you talk to needs to be structurally reformed, using the phrase. So, this is the issue, and it's states, governments are not employment agencies. Governments are there to deliver public goods and services, and I think the challenge we have in South Africa is, we seem to be very, what's the phrase? We seem to be very we acknowledge existing jobs, but we can't seem to conceptualize new jobs and where they'll come from. And that is something which is necessary. We're living in I used the word liberal earlier. South Africa is a very open economy, a very advanced economy in many cases. But I'm afraid there's this disconnect in the political economy of development between the state's view of how economics should be managed and what the private sector actually requires in terms of enabling environment. The better the has to be aligned, the more we'll start to see the growth come through. And real growth, not 1-2 percentage points. That is not going to save or solve our developmental challenges in our country. To move the needle, we need a 4, 5, perhaps even more percentage GDP growth figure over a long period of time, over a generation, Asia style, to really move the needle on development and improving people's lives, which is most important in our country.
Dr. Davies, I'm almost out of time. I'm eventually out of time, but I can't let you go without asking you about how pivotal and how critical a moment is this within the fiscal framework conversation in terms of the public debt situation. We were told, I think, about a year ago that we stood in terms of the stock of government debt at about 3 trillion rand, and 21 cents of every rand of revenue that is generated by government going to debt. And you were alluding earlier on to that figure of over 80% debt to GDP, with the real risk that we could even touch 100% to GDP in terms of the debt situation. So as Enoch Godongwana takes to the podium this afternoon, how critical and how pivotal a moment does he face in starting to turn this situation around?
Well, I think it's, again, I always hear the phrase in our country, we're at a crossroads. I'm tired of being at a crossroads. We need to be on a straight and rapid highway with certainty. The time for crossroads are long gone. Of course, this is an important budget. The trend from Treasury has always been pragmatic and good fiscal management, and that's what's necessary, particularly in the emerging market economy or an aspirant emerging market economy like our own. My big concern really is the global macro, which the budget obviously is not needs to consider as well. Think inflation in developed markets, think import inflation on very high energy prices currently. And of course, the US Fed changing of policy, no more quantitative easing, which will have a very potentially negative impact on economies like our own. So we don't exist in a bubble, and we need to recognize the global macro. It's certainly less enabling than it has been in recent years. South Africa could not grow in the last 10 years inadequate levels of GDP, despite a very strong tailwinds of the global economy. The challenge now, we're trying to figure out growth, that was part of your initial question to Lisizwe, in a very challenging macro. I don't envy our finance minister's task at hand, but the politicians, we need to drive a structural reform agenda to support Treasury's pragmatic management of fiscal part of our economy. Thank you.
All right, I've got to thank you for your time and your insights. Dr. Martyn Davies there weighing in as we build up to Budget 2022 with just about 2 hours and 15 minutes thereabouts before Enoch Godongwana takes to the podium for his maiden budget speech. Of course, he did deliver the medium-term expenditure framework last year.